On Christmas Day in 1994, if you told me that less than 10 years later that I was going to be diagnosed with chronic war-related PTSD, with alcohol abuse, with substance abuse, with medication abuse and tobacco abuse, I would have told you were off with the pixies. You must have been smoking, snorting or drinking something yourself. But that's exactly what happened to me. And I then went through a process where I sought help and I got that help, but that extended through a period where in 2011, as the result of being wiped out financially in the global financial crisis, that I decided that the only way out was to end it all. So I was sitting in my car about to drive over an 80-metre cliff into the ocean below and absolutely end it all. So what was it that made me turn my life around, and how did I take back control of this chronic post-traumatic stress, and how did I stop taking all those antidepressants, the uppers and downers, and I stopped smoking, and I had conquered PTSD, and I had actually taken back control of my life. How did I do that? I see that I was so fortunate that at the time where I needed to ask for help, that there was a whole platform of support services available to me. The Department of Veterans Affairs looked at my doctor's diagnosis and said, "That's it, Kevin, we'll support you," and I've had amazing support ever since then. But let's think about going back to World War I, because on the 11th of November, at the 11th hour of the 11th day, the war to end all wars was finished. But in those days, there was absolutely no support services for the men and women who came home and survived that terrible, terrible conflict. My grandfather served in World War I, and these are his medals. He was with A Squadron of the 9th Light Horse, and he landed on Anzac Day 2015, the 25th of April, into that hellhole of Gallipoli. He then went on to serve in the Middle East, and it was in the Middle East where he fell in love with that whole area of Palestine, Egypt and so on, and he actually took his discharge in the Middle East in 1919. One day he was Captain Gerald Masson, the next day he was the Chief Agriculture Officer for Palestine, which was then the British Mandate territory with its own government. But that's another story to be told in the future, because he had an amazing life in the Middle East and in Palestine. These are my grandmother's medals from World War I. And my grandmother was an Australian Army nurse, and she and my grandfather Jerry actually met in Egypt. But these were the women who also had to deal with those guys who had what was known in World War I terminology as shell shock, those unseen wounds of war. They had to help those poor buggers deal with that too. Amazing, amazing stories. The unsung heroes, these women who looked after these men. Unbelievable. These are my father's medals from World War II. My father was in the British Army, and he was at Dunkirk and then served in the Middle East, and that's where he met my mother, because my mother was born and brought up in the Middle East, and that ties back into my grandfather's and grandmother's stories as well. But I now know that my father also suffered with PTSD. In World War II terms, it was called battle fatigue. But it was, very little was known about it, and for some men it was seen as cowardice. Guys who just could not continue, they'd seen so much, they just could not deal with it anymore. But sadly, as I say, no, seen as cowardice, weakness, and so on. But that's really not the case. We now know that shell shock or battle fatigue, or what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, is a completely natural human reaction to trauma. Scientifically proven, irrevocably, it is not anything other than a natural reaction to what we see or saw and did and were exposed to in wartime. Thankfully, we are so fortunate that we have an amazing array of services and support platforms available to us today, so that our young serving men and women and veterans of more recent conflicts have a place to go and they know that they can get help. And one of the things that we also know today is that a traumatic incident actually causes physical damage to our brain. We know that as a scientifically proven fact, just as we know now that TBI, or traumatic brain injury, is caused by things like detonations, concussions, explosions, and so on. And it's even mirrored, particularly in the United States, with injuries to the brain in NFL football, those constant crashes of heads and so on. And we now see that it's a normal thing that happens to us. What I want to address now is the stigma attached to asking for help. For the poor buggers in my grandfather's day, when you asked for help or you got to a point where you couldn't deal with things anymore, shell shock was seen as cowardice. And it's a sad indictment that 306 soldiers were shot for cowardice. We are so fortunate today that we know that PTSD is caused by a physical injury to the brain. And I want to put it to everybody that there is no stigma involved in asking for help. Your brain has been injured by your exposure to a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events that we see in wartime and have to deal with as soldiers. When I say soldiers, I mean all military people, Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines. But I use soldiers just as terminology that is a convenient word to use, but it sums it up for all of us who have had to deal with this. And that's how my book came about. It was, how did I deal with that issue of being diagnosed with chronic post-traumatic stress, and then the stigma attached to asking for help. And now I want to tell you about my book. Your journey doesn't begin and end with just this book. On the website, you are going to be introduced to an amazing amount of information, and it cuts across everything that you'll find in this book. So the 5-step life plan, the 7 pillars of success. I'm going to be speaking with some of the world's leading psychiatrists, psychologists, people, dentists, doctors, all sorts of people. I'll be talking to health experts. We'll be talking to people about diet, nutrition, the brain, mind, gut axis, across amazing things like that. I'll be talking to military people who have survived the loss of limbs and so on, and about their journey. How did they turn their lives around? How did they deal with what they've had to deal with? Not just the post-traumatic stress, but the physical injury and getting your life back on track. I'll be talking to people about across all of the things connected with goal setting, setting up plans for achieving whatever it is that you want out of life. We'll be talking to people about all aspects of diet, nutrition, exercise, all of those kinds of things. It will be a massive amount of information about what you can put back into your life, not just about what's in this book. So go to the website, have a look at it, and you'll know that over the coming months and years you are going to get a vast amount of information from some amazing people, so that you can actually get yourself to that point where you're sitting on your balcony and saying, ticked everything on my bucket list, I'm happy, I'm fulfilled, and I've had a blast out of life.